it dispels despair. Christianity dispels that. Now that's not your default anymore. Like, love is the default. It's just love. That's all it is. And that's why the Christianity, like Christ, like everything about like our walk with Christ, it's all predicated on love. His love towards us, our love towards him. If we love Christ, we're going to love everybody else. And this is the mystery of our ability to love our enemies. Like somebody that, you know, how we're able to turn the other cheek and go on with living. And
hello everyone, and welcome back to Hate Culture. Back on today's episode, we have Thomas Quackenbush again. Thomas, welcome.
Hey, how you doing, Randall?
I'm doing really good, and you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
So Thomas has been happily married for 15 years now and has 3 children. He is former U.S. Air Force, graduated from the National Gourmet Institute in Manhattan, worked at the Center for Discovery as a chef where food was used as medicine for people with severe mental and physical impairments. His existential and Homeric quest for authenticity led him to Christ and finally to study apologetics, where he studied under Dr. McCurry, another friend of the podcast, also with whom he eventually started Families of Virtue. He now serves as the Vice President of Families of Virtue and as a pastor at Cornerstone Baptist Church, North Carolina. Currently, he's busy with his MA at SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, which makes me a fellow student of his at SES. And he has been enjoying and studying philosophy and psychology for the better part of a decade, hence our conversation.
Yes.
If you want to know a bit more about Thomas's personal life and who he is, I would gladly refer you back to the previous episode where we delved into that a bit more. So, Thomas, before we start off, which MA are you pursuing at SES?
Right at the moment, I'm pursuing the MA in philosophy. I'm really in the early stages of it, just just with all my busyness and just the financial, ish. I'm doing it little by little, but I do a lot of studying on my own as well. So,
okay, that's really cool.
Philosophy is my life in terms of, other than following Jesus Christ, it's philosophy, just understanding reality is kind of what draws me and inspires me.
That's pretty cool. I'm doing the Christian apologetics and theology one. I'm guessing some of our subjects are going to overlap.
Oh yeah,
I did.
Absolutely.
Almost done with my first one, Prolegomena and Biblical Studies, but so far it's been really great. Really enjoying SES a lot.
That's awesome. Happy for you. That's so good.
Oh, thanks. So on the previous episode, you introduced us a bit more to Christian existentialism and existentialism as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going to focus a bit more on atheistic existentialism. Would you briefly explain to us the difference between the two?
All right. So as we think about, because we mentioned Soren Kierkegaard last time as a Christian existentialist, kind of the exemplar, one that really kind of, as he was dealing with his present situation in Denmark with the churches kind of falling away from an individual personal salvation, and just kind of everybody's kind of fading into Christendom, kind of in everybody who's part of Denmark at that time were just part of the body of Christ in some way, just by living there, because it was so he was trying to bring back the person and the individual and having a kind of a true relationship with the personal relationship with Jesus. And so he's really like the one that, and I would say a lot of his writing, the more that I read it, and then reading some of the atheists, they kind of just take his premises and they kind of just remove the Christian aspect of it. And some of his writings, like some of his non-devotional writings, you can kind of do that. You can kind of just look at it, and he's dealing with some ideas and issues in the culture. And then, so they just basically, if you read some of those, as they refer back to Kierkegaard, they just kind of remove the element of God and the idea that we are responsible to a higher being. And they center everything on the individual person. And so basically, I'm going to quote, let's quote I was looking. This is one of the main texts. This is the myth of Sisyphus, which is an essay by Albert Camus, and the very first part of this. So this is kind of, I think, encapsulates the idea, like the kind of the aim and the goal, and kind of like the problem that they're dealing with as an atheist existentialist. And it says this is the very first words in the essay. And it says, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental questions of philosophy. So as Christians, we have a just ingrained in us a purpose and a meaning and a direction. It's for us to have a relationship with God and to grow in the likeness of Christ. And by doing that, we're fulfilling our purpose in life, which is to bring glory to God. Like, that is what we do. So we're not asking those questions. Suicide isn't like a kind of serious question for a Christian. We're just like, yeah, I have purpose. And as God sustains my life and keeps breath in my lungs, I'm going to proclaim the gospel. I'm going to make disciples. I'm going to do those sorts of things. I'm bringing glory to God. For them, it's like, well, you're like, they face the absurdity of life. The fact that they're standing at the abyss and looking out into the world and perceiving that there's, billions of people in this world. We're just like a mere speck in the grandeur of the universe itself. You look at all the planets, and like we're just like this tiny little speck, Earth itself, and then we are within the Earth and just small, insignificant beings. But in ourselves, we have this. We everything we perceive is through our subjective, and really we're a universe in ourselves. Like we're just, everything about who we are is in our subjectivity. So we have a hard time reconciling the fact that I am this being that it's, struggling to sustain life in the midst of all this absurd, like wave of universe and wave of like the millions of people. So insignificant. If I were to vanish or commit suicide or do whatever, I would just be a blip and just never talked about again. And so, like, how do we reconcile life? How do we live this life with this idea that there's no purpose or meaning? And so it's almost like there's this, when you remove God from the equation, which is really just a negation. So they remove God, and they would consider that a delusion, or the idea of hope in their eye, especially religious hope, is kind of they would call it philosophical, kind of like a philosophical, how would I say it, kind of inauthenticity. Like it's almost taking away the burden from the person. Like, you think about the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is this god who was condemned to a life of rolling a rock up a mountain. Just so once you get to the top of the mountain, the boulder rolls back down and he has to turn around and roll it back up the mountain. So it's just like this meaningless task, this kind of like just going through the motions of life without any purpose. Just the whole purpose of life is to roll this boulder up. And he kind of uses that as a metaphor. And he tries to find within that myth, like a place where we have true freedom. And he would say that we would, like, his view would be, this is Camus' view, is that in the midst of like our kind of that repetition of life, that kind of the tedium of life, all those things we have to do, like we have to be able to find freedom in that while we're doing it, so that we can keep a part of ourselves like authentic. So like he would say that we have to believe that Sisyphus was happy in order for us to even make sense of our own lives. Because if he's not, then life is meaningless and is just toil. And like, we're just going to, like, we're just tasked with this for no reason. And we fall into despair. And so suicide is the only option. So that kind of like summarizes some of his thought. but I think it also encapsulates the idea of atheistic existentialism as a whole.
Okay. So if I understood correctly, it is that existentialism started with Kierkegaard, and in Christianity and atheistic side kind of hijacked it, modified it a bit, and tried to as that as an antidote to nihilism.
Yes.
Okay.
It's like trying to, like, they would, Camus would call it the absurd, like this kind of like this disconnect between reality and the self. Like there's like what would motivate you to even like live your life? Like that's the whole question. He's like he says that's the crux of all of philosophy, like the sense of like why live life, like why. And he also, like, what I would say that, like, I guess the positive aspect of it is looking to most people, and I would say the majority of people, we see this even in the Christian community, like everybody kind of just goes in like a majority of people go with the herd, and they kind of just go with the motions, and they believe whatever is being told to them, and they don't think for themselves. It's like that's a majority of people, and both Kierkegaard with the Christendom and the way the church was operating in Denmark, and the way like Sartre and Camus and Kafka and all these existentialists in the 20th century would see the same thing. We're just people just going through the motions, and they don't really have a self-awareness, and really need to wake up and come to this realization that, you know, life is meaningless, and that, but you actually have to kind of engage in it and suffer through this absurd notion that there is no meaning in life, and just kind of create meaning for yourself. So
okay. Yes, you can go on.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So then how does an atheistic existentialist then know truth? What is the epistemology there?
Well, I would say that it kind of, so in their view, it would be a relativism by nature, because it's dealing with the subjectivity, and, you know, trying to make sense of the self. So they would be like, it would like almost like council, and, you know, this kind of the systems that have governed society, including religion, would be something that they would want to ignore, and they would want to not concern themselves with objectivity, but with subjectivity almost exclusively. So it's like, this is kind of where we see, actually, you see it kind of the fruition in America, and, like, you know, going into the 80s and 90s, where it's like you see even in kind of the music and the art culture, because they go hand in hand. It's almost like you have the art and the culture, and they kind of, it's not that, you know, because they always have that question, does art imitate culture? Does culture imitate art? I think there's interplay, and, you know, you'll see that the desperation and the idea of people like just coming up with their own truth, and that you hear that a lot, and that's where that kind of stems from, is that when you're locked in yourself, and you don't allow for something objective to kind of influence you, and you're supposed to kind of remake yourself in some sense, like the epistemological standpoint, the only truth that they can find is within themselves, and what they make of the world, and what they make of themselves in the world. So it's relative.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What then would be if everything is subjective to them, what then would be the ultimate reality in the atheistic existential worldview?
But the ultimate reality essentially is themselves. It's like there's no God, there's no transcendence, there's no like objective truth. Like I think the best that they would, you know, like they granted to like the society around them is like just the basic idea that these things were in existence, like, you know, like our religious orders, our laws and our rules, just to govern the mass of people so that they don't just destroy themselves. Like they look at themselves as an existentialist, as somebody If you ever have you ever watched, or I don't know if the listeners have seen the movie The Matrix, and in the movie, like you have Neo, who he starts to come aware that the Matrix is, he's living in something, and he's starting to see these glitches in his reality, and he's like, is this really all that there is, or is there something more? And so he starts questioning it, and he starts following. There's a lot of like symbolism, like the woman with the rabbit tattoo, like going down that rabbit hole, and he follows her, and he realizes when he meets Morpheus that that there is something. He's actually sniffing in the right place. He's found that there is something more to all of this. That the Matrix is just this computer program that everybody's locked in, kind of slave to, and it's kind of like a metaphor to what we're talking about, because once Neo takes the pill, because he can either stay in the Matrix or he can like see what the Matrix really is. He takes the pill and he wakes up, and then he's on the outside and he sees that the world is really this awful place, and that this Matrix is just this kind of delusion, that they're all stuck in these pods, and the robots and like all the AI are like kind of using their humans as batteries to power their world, and we're just living in this illusion. In some ways, when you wake up as an atheist, that's the kind of world that they wake up to, and they see this world as absurd and without meaning and just kind of terrible. And so they, as themselves, like, what are we going to do? We have to kind of, I think in some ways they kind of have to invent themselves, and they have to grow in a sense of they grow in the sense of like trying to make sense of their lives, and with the idea of this absurdity, and not like, 'cause a lot of times, and they would always say, and if you read more into the myth of Sisyphus, that most people just they might encounter the absurd, maybe a death in the family or something that draws them out of that kind of stupor of like the Matrix or whatever, but then they want so quickly to deny that aspect of life, that there is this, that the world is absurd and there is no meaning in life. So they try to like jump back into the Matrix. They would take the blue pill for the most part, but only the brave ones, only the ones that truly want to make themselves and see the reality for what it is, will take that red pill and and like live in the midst of the absurd and just kind of try to make themselves something more. And that's why like the whole they're they wake up in the Matrix, and then they're fighting the machines, like they're in the true fight for reality. They're in the true. That's kind of, I think that's a great metaphor for like, that's why the movie is good, because it kind of explains a lot of that philosophy in so many different ways.
I think that breaks it down beautifully. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
No problem.
So how would they then view humans? How would they then view humanity and mankind as a whole?
So they would adopt, basically we're just trousered apes. I think Simon Brace uses that terminology a lot when he's describing the atheist idea of human beings. So the idea is like we have evolved, and for whatever reason, just some absurd chance, by we evolved from this, just like kind of the atheistic idea of evolution, that we all have a common ancestor, and we all kind of evolved in some kind of frantic and just through mutations or whatever chance that occurred, and now we are here. We are thrown into this world with all the contingencies, with all of the different aspects. And that's where you get into, Heidegger talks about the thrownness, and this idea that in time, like we have, like, so we don't make ourselves in the sense where because we're born, and so we're born into this time and place with all of like the issues that we have been, our environments, whether we're rich or poor, our color of our skin, all these different aspects, we have no choice in the matter. So like we're in this place and time, and now what do we do with that? And so like we have this consciousness, and in some ways is looked at as like, it's a burden. Being conscious of your own mortality is a huge burden. And so like it's almost looked like growing in consciousness, understanding that we're going to die one day, and that aspect is what drives them. And so that's like, it's such a strange way of thinking about it, but it's based upon that, because it's not like all the different facets in the atheistic world all come together. You have like your psychology with Freud, and you got like all these different ideas, and you got Darwin and the science, all the biologists who agree with that, the evolution, macroevolution. You have all of them coinciding with this idea that we're just, that through human history, by random chance, we are here now. What do we do with our time? How do we make ourselves? So that's kind of what they are. We're just in a process of evolution, and we're just another link in that chain in some sense. So what do you do with your time that you have? And that's kind of their crux and their purpose. So as evolved beings without any sort of like the anthropology, the idea that humans are, we believe as Christians that we have souls, that there's immaterial things that we can't like use science to describe, and there's some in some of my books on Christian existentialism, and really Jacques Maritain, he wrote a book, Existence and Existent, which is a fabulous book on Christian existentialism, and he deals with a lot of these issues. But I think another great quote that kind of signifies kind of the view of despair in the atheist world is actually a Shakespeare quote from the play Macbeth. And these are the words uttered by Macbeth after he hears of Lady Macbeth's death. And it's basically his wife passed. He loved his wife, and his ruin. It's like, this is him facing the reality of his ruin. And he says this. He says, "Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. Is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." So as Macbeth in his facing his downfall as like kind of the climax and like this is where everything is, you're just following along, you're gripped by the story. This is how he describes reality for the person, that it's a story told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And that's kind of that's the starting point of existentialism and the atheistic point of view. That is like, that's where you would come to this realization that life is meaningless. And now what do I do with the rest of my life? And then, as Camus would say, you either commit suicide or try to find meaning in some other way.
That is interesting. That reminds me, I think in the episode on nihilism, Dr. McCuddy spoke about Queen's song Bohemian Rhapsody, where you have the song that's about no meaning, but it has, in a sense, a meaning because it's structured and follows the laws of songwriting and music and stuff. So that just brings that to mind. So that's interesting.
Well, it's funny because it's like a lot of things. I think the atheists have a hard time. There's actually a great book by Frank Turek called "Stealing from God," and he talks a lot about like the ethics and like the idea of that we have purpose in some sense, and like because that's what Camus wrote a book called The Plague, and it deals with that same thing. It's like in a world where like in the book, like it's just this plague is an outbreak, and you have this doctor you're following, and in the midst of this world that has no meaning and purpose, like what does he do? He just like, you just have to just go and do what you're supposed to do. In reality, like, why save humanity? Why do anything? Why exist? What's the purpose? And I think that's where the nihilism, you just continuously, and this is kind of my own personal experience too. Before I came to Christ, it was like I'd have this pursuit. I loved learning, but then at the end of the day, I would just be, what's the point of all that? Like, why have this knowledge? Like, why do anything at all? Because it's just gonna evaporate when I die anyways. And I just like that was constantly facilitating between this idea where I'm gonna go and I'm gonna make something of myself, and then next, like the moment in my life, I'm like, this is all meaningless, and why do anything at all? And that's because that's kind of just what I did. I would go through this periods of just kind of motivation and inspiration, and then the next moment, once that wears off, I'm in despair. And what's really interesting, what Kierkegaard would say, because what he does, and I think what like the necessity of Christ in our lives. He says like he compares two types of love. There's the eternal love or agape love, and then there's eros, which is the self-love. That's what he would call it. And so he usually does that either or in his books, because there might, you have C.S. Lewis with the four loves, and he describes all four loves. But Kierkegaard does it. He just does either or. He usually makes choices. That's the way he operates in his writing. And so he would say that at every point, and he would call this spontaneous love as well. He has many names for it. So like any love that is not directed towards the eternal and the love of God, and that's going to motivate you. And he says that motivates you through that you shall love. That regardless of the circumstances, whether say if it's you and your wife and she decides one day not to love you anymore, you're like, well, if you are, if you have this love, this eternal love in you, you're like, I'm going to love you regardless, because that's what Christ taught me to do. Even if you're my enemy, I'm going to love you regardless. So the self-love, and this is, I think, the farthest that the only love that exists in the world outside of Christ, is this really just a masquerade of the dread that's beneath it. Like there's like, so the whole if you think about it, every time, if you were in a relationship before, and grow, like I was in many bad relationships with when I was a teenager into my early 20s, and really like you have the love that we shared between each other was really kind of this mutual self-love. We just loved ourselves, and that person was meeting our needs. And so once we went through the, our relationship fizzled out, like this dread kind of emerged, and we kind of say, well, that's just love. And in reality, it's just this awful feeling of, this isolation, feeling inadequate, all these different things come with that. In reality, like the love that you had was just kind of like sort of momentary, like an illusion. So once that dissolved, now you're back into that original state, and you're facing the absurd once again. And so it's nothing permanent. And so he would say that you have to, if you really want truly, because as a Christian, our circumstances don't change the fact that we love God. Like that's why when James talks about count it all joy as we experience the various trials in life, we're like, it's possible because the circumstances don't matter. That's just, they come and they go, they ebb and they flow, but we are like steadfast on the rock foundation of Christ, and we love him through all of that. So we're able to remain content and have this sense of joy in the midst of our trials, which in self-love doesn't exist, because once that love, or whatever we call it, is infatuation, sexual desire, whatever things that we have between, say a man and a woman, the eros, as soon as that has dissolved, we're back to that original state. So he would say that all life of self-love is just you trying to kind of remain in that state. And then it, as the temporality, that's the other thing. That's another big theme in existentialism, is temporality and then eternal. The eternal is, doesn't change. The temporal, the world that we exist in the physical world, that comes and goes and it changes. So if we want to stay steadfast, we have to have this eternal love, and it has to be towards God. Otherwise, we are in this kind of, it's just a masquerade of the dread that we feel beneath everything.
Okay. So the whole existentialism thing reminds me of a saying I think I heard in a movie once. I think it is something along the lines of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what existentialism, or specifically atheistic existentialism, is getting at in terms to answer that why do anything question?
Yeah. I think that's a really good quote, like the idea of just trying to make yourself. And I think because as a Christian, we're like, that's not what we do. That's not what we ought to do. We tend to do that because we are very we're stubborn and we kind of lose fat. We kind of, we kind of in the situation, in the moment, we kind of lose faith at times, and we not like a sense that we lose it completely, but we just kind of our momentary kind of distractions. We tend to try to do that, and then we realize that we can't. That Christ is really we depend on Him, and so you're right. It's like this idea that now in the midst of this, as I'm facing the absurd reality that I'm completely and utterly like my life is just a vapor, that it has no meaning whatsoever. Like all I can do is pick myself up from my bootstrap, if that's even possible. You think about the book of Ecclesiastes, that like if you take away the part where at the end where he talks about like, that our sole purpose is to enjoy God and to enjoy what He's given us, and the whole that is just a kind of a standpoint that is like original existential work. The book of Job is in the same way, like how do you deal with these existential issues, and I've been reading through the book of Job in kind of more detail, and it's pretty because he's asking those existential questions. He's like, why? What's the purpose of all this? Why? And he goes really early on, he questions his own, like, why was I even born? I wish I was never born, because then I wouldn't be experiencing this right now. And it's what I can understand atheists in some way because and I think this is a good way for us to really communicate with as we're trying to evangelize and other things, we recognize that we're all faced with the same reality, just that we look at it differently. Well, we see more, they see less. And really, like, we're like, yeah, we both agree that there's evil and that the world is in sense absurd. In some sense, we're to the world, even us as Christians, our lives are meaningless. Like, all the people that we admire, like all the movie stars and the sports athletes, they don't know who we are, even though we're paying all this money for their gear and everything. And if we pass away, even our own family over a period of time, you forget. And I think a lot of times, like you think about even in Africa with the ancestor worship and some of the culture there, it's like, it makes sense. Like if the world is absurd and there's no meaning in it, and like, I do care about this person that just passed away, I have to preserve them in memory, because otherwise they're just going to be completely forgotten. And for Christians, though, it's absolutely amazing, because even our own subjectivity, even our own selves, we have a hard time even, like, we don't know like where we fit in. Like the only way we understand ourselves is by like people's opinions, and we got to take those with a grain of salt. Like, like it's, how do we stand? We look in ourselves in the mirror. We don't really see ourselves as objects. We see ourselves as subjects. And it's really hard for us to really discern who we even are. That's why people are always asking those questions, like, who am I? And it's a reasonable question. But what's beautiful about the Christian life is that God knows us completely. He knows us better than we even know ourselves. And when we actually see Him, after we see Christ face to face, we'll actually understand all things in terms of who we are and our place in the world. And that even though the world cares less about us, and even our closest loved ones, like we can be replaced in some sense. Like I thought about this, is like one of the things that I always think about, that kind of bothers me, that like we can pass away and we have this, like, even with our wives, and they can marry somebody else after we die, and I'm like, that I don't really sit well with me, because it's just like, the idea that things have to move on and life just moves on, and that's just the way life is. But to God, like, we are like infinitely valuable to Him, and His love is directed towards us as individuals. and it's not me as with me. It's like not just me, my family, but me personally. And I have this personal relationship with him. And the atheists have to operate in this world with the same problem, but without any sort of resolve, without any sort of, like I'm going to worship my ancestors because that's the only way that can preserve them in reality, is by just keeping them. This even the Day of the Dead, even in kind of the Hispanic culture, I think in Mexico, they had the same idea. It's like if we every year we come together and we remember the dead, they won't be forgotten. And because amidst the world, they will be forgotten if we're not thinking about them. It's really a way for them to deal with the same problem we're all dealing with. And that's where I always, like, as an evangelist, as somebody that wants to go out and share the gospel, I keep all of these things in mind because, like, everybody's dealing with the same issue, but we have the solution to that issue. We're the only solution to that issue, because otherwise it's just absurd. We're just basically oscillating between, trying to make ourselves and then commit suicide, as Camus would say. Because what's the point of life? Why continue to live when we can just end it right now and just be annihilated? It's such a kind of sorry state. But also, as an atheist too, there's like with this subjectivity and this, I think, coming to Africa and South Africa and seeing America from a different perspective, I really kind of started getting the idea that we are very individualistic, and the relativism is deep in America because we're all our own personal gods in some sense. And we just, it's like, long as we're happy, like it's all that matters. And you see it through social media. It's all about, me being happy and being like, whatever. It doesn't really extend outwards, because a lot of times, like when people are in despair and they're going through depression, self-love and that continuously just trying to make yourself happy, kind of like, it just in that flattery that people try to give that person so they get out of that state of depression, doesn't work. In reality, you have to step outside yourself and you kind of deny yourself and help other people. And that's like the idea what Christ is trying to teach us, denying ourselves of those, those momentary pleasures and actually empathizing and helping other people, stepping outside yourself. That's really going to bring meaning and purpose in your life. Because if we're just self-centered, we're just like kind of like this everybody's walking around as their own like world. And as long as our worlds don't bump into each other, we're happy. But when they do, how dare you? How dare you? Every time, like, that's why Christianity is so villainized in America, is because how dare you have these set of rules that, like say homosexuality is wrong. Like, how dare you say that? How dare you like interrupt my truth and what I believe? Because with the reality of life, it's just a hopeless situation.
It is. So the existentialism is an attempt to be an antidote to nihilism and to have, as we said, to have some meaning in life. And we've discussed the fact that in a sense it's subjective, but what makes the Christian side objective is the fact that it is grounded in God himself. But does the atheistic existentialist then succeed in this task, in his quest to find meaning?
I don't think ultimately no, because if you can't get outside, because one of the things so Kierkegaard he takes the task of because this is our tendency too, because as human beings, like for you, for example, me and you are in this conversation right now, and I only perceive you as an object. That's how we come to know things. Everything outside ourselves is an object, hence objectivity, the things outside the self. Like what was happening in culture, especially Kierkegaard's time, and sometimes even with, especially the centuries that he was living in and coming up to, before the postmoderns came about, and this idea that everything can be resolved through reason and science was such a high touted instrument of the human endeavor, that we have this key to unlock all the mysteries of the universe. So if you read any of the stuff from that period of time, even like Hegel, that was what Kierkegaard was dealing with, they had a very optimistic view of the human existence and our ability to understand all things. And then Kierkegaard's like, whoa, wait a minute. What about this immensity, this infinity within the self? Like our own subjectivity, that, how we, because there's a difference between objective truth and subjective truth, because objective truth is outside ourselves, and we, it's explaining the laws of the universe. Subjective truth is our, basically how we kind of take how do we react, and how do we kind of how do we react to the objective truth. So a lot of the existentialists would react in a way where it's like, it's just about me, and it's about like finding my own values and my own system and making myself. I'm going to ignore the counsel of the world and the natural law. I'm going to say that doesn't exist, that all it is subjective truth. So it's really difficult, like, because for all intents and purposes, like, all I get is, I'm trying to make sense of everything, and all I have is like, this, what my senses are telling me, and then within myself, I have to try to make sense of everything and then conform myself to that. If I, that's what Christians would do. We see that the Bible tells us to do such things. And as we conform ourselves more and more to it, it becomes part of who we are. So like, that's how the Christianity works. As more we abide in Christ, the more we become like him, because we're embodying those truths. But if we completely ignore those truths as objective and something that are prescriptive towards our own existence, then we're going to try to make ourselves. And so by default, because if we don't have anything outside ourselves, all we have is ourselves, and we kind of deny the reality of the natural law and then also God's law in terms of the scriptures. So when you're as an atheist, you're really like, this task at hand really has no solution. Like, it's almost like you're punting the ball to the future. So you're in the present now, and you're like, well, I think humanity, if I believe it's evolving, we have to just kind of help it along. So it's almost like you're like I guess the hero task of an atheistic existentialist would be to, like, kind of sacrifice yourself for the future, whatever that means. And for good or bad, that's what you're going to do. And I think Camus, if you would read his book, The Plague, is that's his kind of way of explaining, like, the ethics of, because how's there ethics in a subjective world? Like, how do we step outside ourselves and, work towards the greater good? You have to make it up. You have to, you got to just kind of almost force that into yourself and just make yourself do something for the good, whatever that may be. And the problem is that the things that they're doing, that doesn't necessarily mean is actually going to help them in the future. They have no idea. That's why we need objective truth. That's why we need the scriptures, because by following the scriptures, we have something else that's eternal, that doesn't change, that as more we conform ourselves to that truth, we don't have to really concern ourselves about the future. God is in control. For the atheist, we're in control, and the whole future is determined by our own actions. So we're trying to determine the future for ourselves. And hence, like, the push for, like, a lot of the extremists and alarmists for, like, the climate change. It's a religion in itself. It's like, we have to deal with this. There's the world's the planet's warming up, and we're going to go into this ice age, and all of existence is going to, we're wholeheartedly responsible for the fate of our planet. We're wholeheartedly responsible for everything. And so what do? We have to, we have to fight this our own annihilation. and as a human species has to come together and fight back, from our own annihilation so we can persist. Like that's like a huge task, and that's burdensome beyond like our own human comprehension. And you see that, like that's why the burdens, either you take this burden like Sisyphus pushing that rock up the mountain, or you just commit suicide, because both are viable options, and it really either way it makes it's like life is meaningless anyways. So it's such a strange thing, and that's why like when Macbeth says that it's just human existence is just a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's the default. So once you cease from trying to make yourself, whatever that means, you default back onto this idea that everything's just sound and fury, and this whole tale of human existence is told by a person that doesn't know it. That's the way. Another movie, because what's great about existentialism itself is that it's explained a lot through literature and through art. So you have Forrest Gump is another one, and Forrest Gump is the existential life. It's this guy, he's mentally handicapped, and you have this feather that floats down in the beginning of the movie, and then it just like, all right, now it's turn for him to explain his life. And he never like achieves, he's like talk about virtue and other things. All he does is allow life to kind of pass through him, and he just kind of accepts everything that is thrown at him, and you're just watching life, his just all this day, it's all just fate happening to Forrest, and there's really no true growth in him. He stays the same throughout the whole movie. It's just that he remains in that state of mind. He's just completely, he's not reflective at all. He just allows things to happen. And then at the end of the movie, after all these events occur, you have 50 years of American history. The feather floats away, and then, that's it. that's the extent of it. All this stuff is just a momentary thing, and just a flash in the pan, and then it's all over.
Kind of signifying that the whole thing of the feather floating, that nothing really matters. And then, so if I understand correctly, it sounds like eventually you would just fall back into nihilism.
Yep.
And back into despair.
Yep. Despair is hidden. It's almost like, if you're reading in the book of Genesis, where chapter 4, where God's talking to Cain, and Cain, he says that sin is crouching at the door, that you have to be careful. It's the same kind of idea. Like this despair is crouching in every moment, and all we're doing in life is trying to sugarcoat that and try to kind of ignore the fact that everything's meaningless, and that despair is just hidden behind all self-love. Like I said, like there's so many relationships I was in, as soon as they ended, like 2 weeks later, I'm over it. Even though while I was going through the process of breaking up, I was in despair. I mistake that despair for love. And, because that's like literally what it is. Like that awful feeling, like when you're worrying about somebody, like say cheating on you or being unfaithful in some sort of way, like your whole life is dependent on this person and their opinion of you. And if they still find you attractive, if they still find you interesting, once that disappears, you're back into that state of despair. And we mistake the despair. It's like, I must have loved this person so much because this is how I'm feeling. I'm like, no, that's the default feeling that you have. And that self-love that you were having with this person is just a momentary distraction, because it's nothing persistent. I see this like it's like in marriages, people come together with these both have self-love. They're each other. It's almost like you're just glorified roommates, kind of sharing the responsibilities of life. And then whenever you feel like dissolving that relationship, everybody's like, okay, I'm gonna end this relationship, fall into despair until I find another person to fill that void, so that I can go back into this kind of. It's almost like it's illusion. You're entering in. But imagine like making the movement and saying that regardless of like, I'm gonna love for the sake that I'm just gonna love, and it's like doesn't matter who you are, I'm gonna love. That's the Christian idea, because it dispels despair. Christianity dispels that. Now that's not your default anymore. Like, love is the default. It's just love. That's all it is. And that's why the Christianity, like Christ, like everything about like our walk with Christ, it's all predicated on love. His love towards us, our love towards him. If we love Christ, we're going to love everybody else. And this is the mystery of our ability to love our enemies. Like, somebody that, you know, how we're able to turn the other cheek and go on with living and knowing that we're going to die, but we have this beautiful hope of seeing Christ face to face, and all of our desires, all the sorrow in our life dissipates before him, and we just see him how he is, and he sees us how we are, and all that despair, it just vanishes in a moment. And that hope is such a beautiful aspect of what we believe in, and just the beauty of this eternal love, a love between us and our God that sustains us in this life and allows us, because our ethic is built into our religion. Our ethic is built into our belief system, because we're supposed to love our neighbors like we love our neighbors as ourselves. That's our ethic. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to make up anything. You don't have to make yourself. God has made you who you are. He's given you these gifts to utilize to make a living, to help your fellow person, to build the churches. Like, he gives you all this. All you got to do is utilize it and give thanks to God for him giving you breath in your lungs, and you have this because you're walking your life in love, and you have this attitude of thanksgiving, and you have this perspective of just like everybody you encounter, loving on them and trying to, basically everywhere you go, you're trying to make things better than when you found them. And this is coming from a place of eternity, like where it doesn't ever evaporate. Like, this love just continues to grow and grow and grow, and it never dissipates. So it's like that despair that's hidden, like when Cain, when God was warning him that sin that's crouching at the door no longer is there. And now we have true freedom, true liberty, because now we're not bound to any person in terms of like if they love me or not. I'm not bound to some job that they find me valuable or not. We're not bound to any sort of temporal thing at all. We're bound to Christ, and all these things we recognize that it's fading away. I mean, I'm going through 1 John with my teenagers on Wednesday nights. That's the theme. He's like, don't love this world. Everything in this world is fading away. Don't get yourself caught up with the temporal. Don't get yourself caught up with these momentary kind of like ups and downs in life. Focus on what's important. And God will get you through those ups and downs in life, because he allows those things to occur so that you can grow in wisdom and virtue. So ask God for wisdom. And as you're going through those things, they're going to hurt. I'm not saying you're not going to hurt. That's part of life. But through that hurt, we don't lose faith. We don't lose heart. Our hope sustains us so that we can truly live in freedom and liberty in Christ. That's so beautiful. And that was the antidote for me. And this is I'm speaking from my own experience. Like, the reason why existentialism is so interesting to me is because that's like by default, my life, that's where that was the default philosophy. That was the self-love of existential living, that was my life as a growing up. I mean, you think about just the culture at that time, like the music, like we have these rock stars, the grunge movement coming in the early 90s, and they just were emulating these men, these guys that are on stage and doing all these outrageous things, and they're just living life to the fullest, so to speak. But all of them, like majority of them, either committed suicide or like OD'd and died. And like you're like, that's not really, sustainable. That's not really happiness. That's not really truth. That's just, this person trying to live out their lives and trying to make a difference in their art or whatever. But then at the very end, they just end everything and it just gets taken away from them. And that kind of opened my eyes. Another time, my wife, like it's before we got saved, like I was constantly reading and reading all kinds of different things. Most of the most of the authors that I was reading, they're like dead men and women. My wife's like, you spend more time with the dead than you do with the living. I kind of it just blew my mind, because I was just completely just absorbed in myself, in my own kind of intellectual journey, and kind of neglected everything else in my life. And because what else, that was what else is there. And like for me, this intellectual journey is all I have. There's no meaning, no purpose. At least I can claim that I'm smart or something. And so my whole family was suffering because I misunderstood my purpose in life. And really, I misunderstood the fact that there is no purpose. I mean, I thought there was no purpose. But then when we came to Christ, everything changed. And first thing God had me do is really focus on my family and my wife and my relationship with her, because that's what's really going to, because God had plans for me to go into ministry in the future. And you have to have your household in order for you to, work in God's household in the church. So I gained eternity in my salvation. I gained that perspective of eternity, and it changed every aspect of my being. And so I look back, I understand the existentialists. I understand the atheists. I understand where they're at. I pity them, because I feel like they're sniffing up the wrong tree or something. There's something about I understand where they're coming from, because I was there, but I also understand that Christ is the answer, the antidote to that despair that's lurking behind every corner.
Sure. Okay. So you referred to the grunge rock bands. Was one of them Kurt Cobain from Nirvana that committed suicide just because nothing mattered at all?
Exactly. Yeah. Because you think about it's funny because I love music, and I was obsessed with music. That's why that grunge music and that alternative music in the 90s, all of that, even the hip hop music at that time, all of it influenced me, thinking, the lyrics, all of it. As a kid, I remember I got a Green Day album when I was in 6th grade, and it was there's a lot of cursing, and the themes in it were quite perverse. My mom read the lyrics of one of my CDs, and she brought it back to the store and trying to return it. He's like, "Did you read this filth?" Because that guy asked if it was broken. Mom was like, "No, it's not broken. Just a word. This is filth." But anyways, yeah. So Kurt Cobain, he had that. He kind of he was emblematic of that movement. He is regardless of what you think of Nirvana and their music, they shaped that. They shaped the grunge movement. They shaped that culture that grew up in the 90s and culminated in the late 90s, with, I think, the culmination, because we have the 60s with Woodstock, which is a huge phenomenon as a music festival, or peace, love, and music. But they still had a sense of the Christian ethic at that time. The 90s completely abandons the Christian ethic, and you get Woodstock 99. If you watch any of the documentaries on that, I don't suggest anybody does it, because quite it's not really the most edifying documentary, but those just the idea that life is meaningless and we're just going to do whatever we want. But Kurt Cobain, you're reading it, his music, and you're seeing these things, and then at the height of his career, he shoots himself, and then he's still this. People still trying to make sense of all of that. There's Scott Weiland, which is the guy from Stone Temple Pilots, had a heroin addiction. You get towards the end of his lyrics and his later albums, all about heroin, all about addiction. Same thing with Alice in Chains. Same thing with all these groups that were coming out, all about their addictions, and people just putting them on these pedestals, and they recognize when they were there, all this, their ambitions all of their, like, their goal in life is to become famous and rich and have, all this power and fame or whatever. They get to that place and they realize it's all meaningless, that it really doesn't bring any sort of happiness. And all of them, even with you get in the late 90s, you get Linkin Park, Chester Bennington, because he commits suicide, but later on. But if you read the lyrics, you're like, it's almost like after he committed suicide, I couldn't even listen to them because it seemed like one long suicide note. It's just him in despair, talking about his despair. And it's poetic and it seems so beautiful to the listener, but he's just crying out for help. And the end of that despair is death. And, so you're like, what do I do? Like, all these people I wanted to be like, all these writers I would read, like, I was big into Jack Kerouac, which is, I think the predecessor of the hippie movement and the free love movement. You had the Beat generation in the 50s, in the late 40s and early 50s. And when he ended up dying because he was just a sloppy alcoholic, and he was just completely miserable. He achieved all the things he said he wanted to achieve. He got all this fame and fortune or whatever. And then I remember reading his books as an adult and realizing, like, this dude was just an alcoholic. I thought he was a hero when I was in my 15, 16 years old. Guy doing whatever he wants, living his life to his fullest. And then as an adult, I'm like, this guy is just, he's not somebody to emulate. And so you see that, like the cultural shift in the 90s is just like, it was just such a weird situation of just this atheistic kind of ideology that's permeating, because now we have rejected the idea of Christianity almost wholesale. And we're seeing the first fruits of these bitter fruit of what that means. What does it mean when God is dead? And Nietzsche would say that we had like he goes into that dialogue about the death of God, and really it's just the death of like our idea of God, because he didn't believe God existed. And what does that mean? We have to make our own values. We have to go beyond good and evil. We have to kind of come up with our own set of morals. We have to come up with our own set of ethics. And we have this huge burden on our shoulders. And we watch people trying to do that, and they're all committing suicide and, dying young. And, like that's the end of trying to make yourself, is really just death. And, think about it, even now, like after COVID, all these bands that were big in the 90s are trying to resurge themselves because they're still trying to find meaning in their lives. And they're, you see them, they're still writing albums and no one cares about, because, that's just what happens. Like, we move on, society moves on, and you're just, it's just them trying to stay in the spotlight. So it's kind of a cruel and kind of a cruel, like, world of trying to remain on top. And that is precisely why we don't want to be like the world, because it doesn't love us. It doesn't love anybody. It's inert. It has no love for anything. And really, like, you just follow all this. Is like basically the book of Ecclesiastes. You're reading that he explained all this early on. He tried all these things, and he's found at the very end of trying, sleeping with thousands of women, it's all vanity. Having all the money and the riches that he can possibly accumulate, all vanity. Having all the wisdom in the world, all vanity, all of it. And the only really true thing that you can do in life, the only actual meaningful thing, is to have a relationship with God. Like, literally, that's it. That's all we have. And I would say that's all we need, because that's precisely what we were created for, is to enjoy God, to give him glory, and to proclaim his gospel. That's like, just so that other people can all share in that same like love that God has bestowed upon us.
Yeah, and I think another example I can think of is the TV series House. Don't know if you're familiar with it. Dr. Gregory House is like the perfect example of, and I think they started shooting, I think, in 2006 until 2011 is when the series ran, and he flip-flops between nihilism and existentialism, and and if he can't find meaning, he would just numb himself with Vicodin. And you see this miserable person, and but also what I want to emphasize is, and you can comment on that if you want to, how it also has an effect on the people around him. And I don't know if that, obviously, like Kurt Cobain committing suicide had an effect on the people around him. I can't remember which band. I think I might be incorrect, but I think it was Sting and the Police who wrote a song about Kurt Cobain's suicide and them not understanding what happened. But I could be mistaken. But I know there's a band who wrote about it. So the consequences is not merely for yourself, but also the people around you.
Oh yeah.
This despair that you're going into.
Yeah, it's like dropping a rock into a lake, and you see those ripples, and then if you drop many stones into the lake, those ripples kind of intersect. So and they can disturb one another, and so those rings of that kind of the event, say a suicide or say some sort of tragedy happens, and you symbolize that by the rock plunging into the depths of the water, and all of that reverberates. It's not isolated in a moment. Like for me, like for any of us, like think about, because sometimes we kind of contemplate this, like what if I didn't exist? What if something happened to me right now? What kind of effect did it have on everybody? And because like for me, like say suicide in a sense, because I have I have young boys. I have two sons and my daughter as well. Like what does that mean for like their dad committed suicide? Like how does that taint the rest of their lives? Having that idea that my father found no meaning and purpose in his life, and the best thing for him to do is to just end it all. Like, what does that mean for me? I think that's like across the board, like the death of a marriage. Like, what kind of effect does that have? Like, that my parents, like, they loved each other. They created me, supposedly created me in love. And then they just decide that they don't love each other anymore. And they just end that marriage. Like, what does that say for them? What does that say for their view of love? And how does they reconcile the idea of eternal love with their parents that don't believe in it at all? Everything, like it's all these things, all these deaths of very important things have a tremendous effect. Kurt Cobain's death still, people are like talking about him. I mean, I see it on social media. He's still this icon, and his suicide almost like that effect is just still reverberating. I mean, he has children that were affected by it. Even Brad Noel from Sublime, he died of heroin overdose. Right, like a couple of years, maybe. I think after Kurt Cobain, we're really close to that. There's a whole bunch of musicians that died. There's actually this whole study on like at the age 27, how many musicians died. Like you have Janis Joplin, you got Jimi Hendrix, you got Jim Morrison, you got, I think Kurt Cobain was about that age. And then you have all these people, and you're like the impact they had, that their death had on the society as a whole. Like in some ways we idolize them in a sense, but in the real sense of like the people that were so close to them, their lives were tremendously affected and just like kind of ruined in some sense. Like our choices that we make, like in our lives, have like tremendous effect for good or evil, whatever we choose to do on the people around us. We're so interconnected in society because that's what it is. God has created us to be social beings, and our ideas have consequences. Our actions have consequences, and we don't get to just choose these like to end our lives because without having any sort of consequence, we just kind of escape. And it's a supremely selfish act to commit suicide. It's supremely like, just how much more selfish can you possibly be? And I understand that this despair in that. I had suicidal ideations in my life, and I've contemplated it like a lot early in my life, and I thought through it, and like the only thing that kept me from actually committing it was the idea that what's going to affect my mother and my family. Like I didn't want that. Like how does that affect her? Like think about like couldn't imagine my sons like it would just destroy me, because I know that they're sitting in that despair without any hope, and that's the only option that they can think of. Like, what does that say about me as a dad? Like,
Sure.
It's just it's such and you think about it, even with Camus, like just because kind of making this like this is the only choices you have in life is try to make yourself into something and try to fight against this absurd notion that life is meaningless, or you just commit suicide. Like there's got to be something else. To me, like there has to be more. Like there's everything around me screams purpose. Everything about my being screams that there's meaning. Like, because we wouldn't be so obsessed with the idea of finding meaning if there was none. That's always brought me to, even like from an atheist point of view. Like, so if you're familiar with the Pokemon series, I always thought this was interesting. So to bring some of the millennials and people. I was kind of a little old for Pokemon, but my kids are into Pokemon. And so we watched this movie on Netflix called Mewtwo. It was like Mewtwo Returns or Mewtwo Revenge or something. I forgot what it was. But anyway, so Mew is a created Pokemon. Like they created him in a lab. And then Mew was in the wild. Then Mewtwo was this one they created. And in the movie, which I found interesting, is the very first part of the movie when he comes self-aware. The first thing that this creature does, and this is people, the writing, is figure out why he exists. He's like, why am I here? What is my purpose? Why did you create me? And I found that really interesting. Like that's the first thing that this, like as they're writing this story, what this creature coming self-aware thinks of. It's like in this existence, in this world that we're living in, our very instinct is to try to find meaning in it and purpose and find where our place is in it. And that's what we tirelessly do our whole life. That's that boulder we roll up the hill and it keeps falling down. That's it. What's our purpose? Where do we fit into this world? If life was just meaningless, it would just be just torture. It's just awful. Consciousness is a curse at that point, because I'd rather be an animal without any consciousness of myself, and just knowing that, not having any idea that I'm going to die one day and just going about my unconscious life. Being conscious is like the search for meaning. It's just, and the only place you find satisfaction is in our creator, the one who created us and gave us purpose and gave us meaning. And that's where you finally find that peace in your heart. Otherwise, you're just in this perpetual kind of like searching through a haystack looking for that needle somewhere deep down inside it, and you never really find it unless you find Christ, or Christ finds you in that sense, because we can't reason ourselves to God. God, his love is poured out on us, and his the gift of salvation was given to us even when we were his enemy, which is beautiful. Like how much more what a more beautiful idea than that we have this being that he, even though we deserve justice of all the sins we committed, that he has mercy on us, and that, that he sent his son to die for us so that we can have a relationship with him. Like that is like, there's nothing better than that. There's nothing more true than that. That kind of satisfies our longing. That's going to, satisfies every aspect of our being. So.
Yeah, I think that, I see time is catching up with us, but I think that is a beautiful place to end. And to kind of something with what you said earlier, and this is that to end on is that the antidote to having despair crouching at your door, and the antidote to suicide is Jesus himself. Mm-hmm. And meaning is found in Jesus himself.
Absolutely.
Thomas, thank you very much for this episode. I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah, I think it was clear from this episode that ideas have consequences, and so
I appreciate you having me on. It's an honor. It's an honor to be part of this, and I look forward to this. Since the last time we met, it was I love talking to you, and I love what you're doing. I think this podcast is really needed, and I think that you're doing a really good thing here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I also enjoyed it and looked forward to it. Thank you very much, and to those at home, until next time, goodbye.